Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there. Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Thank you so very much for joining us. I'm very excited to have our guest on today. He's a congressman from the great state of Arizona, Arizona's 5th Congressional District. His name is Andy Biggs. Congressman, listen, let's just jump right into it. We have the recent reports now that the Inspector General at Customs and Border Protection was telling, or we find out that CBP was ordering folks to not offer up registration numbers to folks who are coming in the country. So now we have no way of tracking who knows how many people. This is a particular issue that is near and dear to your heart in Arizona. Talk about that.
Yeah, we could actually, Andrew, we could spend hours talking about it. But let's just talk about what's happening today. Reports, 203,000 encounters. Most people don't realize what an encounter is. Yeah. An encounter on the border is where somebody has been arrested or surrendered. And 203,000. Every day in a small town of Yuma, 1,000 people are encountered.
Amazing.
Yeah, and so this is what you see happening, but something that's really dangerous that we're not really reporting on enough is this year over 500,000 known gotaways.
Wow.
And then it's estimated another 500,000 unknown gotaways. So what that boils down to is you've got 1 million people that we don't even know where they're coming from, what their intentions are, where they're going. But the bottom line is most of the people that are coming in, the 2 million people that came in the last 12 months, we don't know where they are either.
I want to talk about, there was a recent congressional hearing you guys had. I want to talk about that in a second. But your role as vice chair of the Western Caucus. So I've been out to Western states, spent a lot of time working on public lands issues. I've watched people cross the border illegally in California, and in Arizona, which is incredibly disturbing. This is 15, 20 years ago. But the issue of federal land ownership and the issue of wilderness areas in places like Arizona, that helps to exacerbate this problem, right? If you have large swatches of land that are owned by the federal government, the federal government doesn't patrol them and gives, illegals unfettered access to interstates. I had a conversation with a radio DJ down in Tucson about this. Talk about those issues and how the two issues can get interrelated.
Yeah, so until about a year and a half ago, actually under the Trump administration, they started allowing it. There was a wilderness preserve sitting right on the border.
Yeah.
And what would happen is illegal aliens would come in. We won't get into how many ways they would come in, but they would drive their vehicles and they cut roads into this pristine wilderness. Sure. And at that time, our CBP agents were not allowed to even go on there.
Right.
Because
they're wilderness areas.
They're wilderness areas. So now, for a while there, they had to ask permission to chase, and my understanding is now they can go on. But the problem is, let's take Arizona for instance. You've got over 60 linear miles of a native reservation.
Sure.
And so that reservation, we get to patrol a little bit, but there's no fencing there.
Yeah.
And that is it's a huge corridor for drug and human trafficking. And so anytime you've got these open areas where the federal government is controlling the land, maybe they're leasing land to ranchers, but it's federally owned.
Sure.
And they just might have a 2 or 3 strand barbed wire fence there. Well, it is a trafficking hub.
Right. So they just come right up. Now you run, as I understand it, you take people down to the border to sort of watch this. As I said, I've been down working on other public lands issues. Happened to just be driving along I-10 along the border and saw this. Tell us about your trips. How this works.
So I every few months I take members of Congress down. Now, I go down all the time myself, but I will also invite some to come with me now and then. And we've taken dozens and dozens of members. So last time was just a couple weeks ago in Yuma. So I'll give you the way it works. Right now the super highway of illegal crossings is really running midnight to about 6:30, 7 a.m.
Sure.
Why? It's hotter than heck.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I had them down there, and it's 116 degrees, middle of the day. That's just kind of the way the tour had worked out. And I said, look, you're not going to see anybody crossing, you guys. Yeah. Nobody's coming across. But sure enough, there are people coming across.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a family from Russia, 3 people from Russia, and mom, dad, daughter. What's the first words, or almost the first words they say? we want asylum.
Sure, of
Right?
course.
So it's nonstop. You see it, and the reason I do this is because until people see it,
Right.
it's hard to understand. It's hard to appreciate.
Listen, this was certainly the way it was for me. I mean, I'm driving along to deal with a federal lands issue, driving along I-10 and just watching people cross the border. It's like, wait a minute, it's mind-blowing to me. Now, at the time, there was a Wackenhut bus that picked somebody up. But again, the idea, what if the bus hadn't been there? What if somebody else had picked them up? I mean, it is amazing to me. Now, along these lines, you were just telling me about a hearing that was recently had, and we're talking about election issues in Congress. We're talking about disclosure issues in Congress. Talk about this and how it relates to the illegal immigration issue.
Well, so a lot of people say to me, why? I mean, this is overtly intentional on the part of this administration to open the border. People say, well, why is that? Well, so yesterday, or recently we had a hearing.
Yes, I get it.
Yeah. We had a hearing in Judiciary, and it was a voting rights deal, and so we said, well, we want to clarify that nothing you're doing here,
Sure.
because their language would allow any person to vote. And we said we want to clarify that only the U.S. citizens could vote. They voted that down on a party line vote. So this. They unintentionally reveal their hand constantly.
Right.
That this is about, they want more voters. They think they're going to get more voters by incentivizing people to come here and giving them benefits, social welfare benefits.
Right. I mean, it goes along with this whole idea of, they want to expand the voter base by whatever means necessary. This is also part and parcel of the folks who want to lower the voting age from 18 to 16. I'm going to take the controversial position and say we should be going the other way, especially now that we no longer have an all, or a mandatory army, we have an all-volunteer military. But yeah, I mean, this is all part and parcel of this to change the voting side of it. Yeah. Let's talk about the federal lands issue and the work of the Western Caucus. Because I've done some work in Nevada. 86% owned by the federal government. I know in Arizona it's a little bit lower, but still it creates huge challenges, especially in northern Arizona, right? People forget that your district, the 5th, is roughly in the center of the state. There's a huge swatch of land north of you.
Yeah, absolutely. And, so the Phoenix metro area has 5 million people, and so people think, Arizona's just Phoenix, but it's not. Arizona's like the fifth geographically largest state in the country. And of that, roughly 82% of it is controlled by a government, either federal or state.
Okay, got it. That's interesting.
Yeah. So what happens is, I mean, it impacts everything from how do you fund schools? Well, most states, and Arizona included, uses state property taxes, right, to fund. Well, when you can't expand your property tax base because we don't own the land. So what happens then is the federal government steps in, and then they as they do, they screw it up, and they underfund.
Yeah, payments in lieu of taxes, bill payments.
Yeah, that's right, bill payments. So they step in, those are underfunded, but then we don't have enough money to expand it anyway, and so everybody gets to be underfunded, and then there's mismanagement. So you have things like in California, they're throwing out over 100,000 acre feet of water every year that their state needs. We need some. If they're going to throw it out, send it to Arizona. But so you got the water mismanagement, you got forest mismanagement.
Yeah.
So the reason why, so you get tremendous erosion, and then you also have lots of wildfires in the West. And those wildfires would be far more easily managed if you would allow people to go in and kind of manage the forest the way they used to. But right now, the federal government encroaches on all of this stuff.
So before you came to Congress, you were president of the state Senate, right? And you were in the state Senate for a number of years, so you were particularly attuned to the challenges that local governments face in Arizona. I know when I was working on an issue in Nevada, one of the things they talked about was the feds back east being a poor neighbor. So for instance, this one county, there was this is before cell service, there was about 100 yards of federally owned land between the highway and where the phone line was and where the county dump was. Right. And in order to get the phone line strung across, they had to go through all of the paperwork with the Department of the Interior. These are the kinds of challenges that local governments in Arizona are facing all the time, aren't they?
Exactly
Yeah.
right, and what a great way of putting it.
Thank you.
That your eastern, the federal government back east is a poor neighbor
Oh,
to
yes.
the local government. That's
Yeah.
a great way of putting
Thank you.
it, because it really is.
Yeah.
That really is the problem.
So let's shifting our attention, because I want to talk about the fifth, and I want to talk about your background a little more. But before we get there, well, actually, we'll go in it this way. You're an author. You wrote a book. I have the title here, "The Con of the Con." I recently had a chance to chat with Ilya Shapiro from the Manhattan Institute. He's a great constitutional scholar. And we were talking about the amendment process and the Constitutional Convention. You are concerned, as I am, about a runaway Constitutional Convention. Talk about that.
Yeah, so, and that's why I wrote the book,
Yeah.
because I took that position and I ended up debating all over the country, and people would say, well, why? How can it possibly be against it? Well, here's why. There's two ways to amend the Constitution. One is a convention way. They're calling it the Convention of the States, but in order to get that convention going, you still have to involve Congress.
Yeah.
You petition Congress, and you get 3/4 of the states to petition, and they come in, and Congress issues the call.
Yeah.
Now people say, oh, it's just a ministerial function. It is not
No.
just a ministerial function. Congress can set up whatever parameters. They get to set the date, the time, the location, and they could say, you're going to cover these areas, other areas would not count. Well, there's no way, with the money and the media that's out there, there is no way you can have a convention like you had in 1787
Right.
with the founders, because what happened there is they could close up the doors, and they could keep everybody there, and nothing would get out.
Sure.
And it didn't get out.
Right.
That wouldn't happen today, and it would be manipulated. And I will just tell you, people on the right get ticked at me, but people on the left get ticked at me too, because believe me, just as many people on the left have constitutional amendments that they want to propose as people on the right.
Without a doubt. I mean, listen, we had this piece that was recently in Politico by, I think it was by John Harris, about the way to deal with, if you believe that Donald Trump is a threat to the Constitution, the only way to solve it is to amend the Constitution. And you know, this is deeply troubling to me, because you're right. It's one of those things where you have folks on the left who would want to get rid of the Second Amendment. They would want to certainly change the definition of how property can be taken in the Fifth
Everything
Amendment.
from marriage, you name it. I've got it sourced in my book. I mean, all this stuff. But the bottom line is this.
Yeah.
Andrew, it's always the question that they can't answer to me. I always ask them: is it the people who are in power that fail to follow the Constitution, or is it the Constitution the problem? Which is the problem?
Right.
It's not the Constitution. I
100%.
guarantee you.
Agreed.
It is
Yeah.
the people that ignore the Constitution, but we have the mechanism as people of the United States to enforce that, and it isn't necessarily changing the Constitution. It is actually changing the people.
I had this conversation a few years ago with a member of Congress. I was working on small business issues and regulatory issues, and I know that's another area of interest of you. And he said, how do we get to, now at the time, the regulatory state only cost the American economy about $1.2 trillion annually. We're now probably above $3 trillion, at least by my estimates. And he said, well, what's the problem here? Because he was looking for me to say that it was, you know, the administration and the agencies. And I said, well, no, Congressman, it's your problem. You're the reason, you know, you and your colleagues are the reason why, is because you're passing vague laws that leave the wording open to massive interpretation. And listen, this is not to knock members of Congress. Obviously, I want to thank you for being here. But talk about the problem of politics and vague legislative language and giving the agencies all of this power.
So that you've touched on two or three things, and I want to hit them all.
Please.
First of all, we should not be delegating rulemaking authority to these agencies.
Yeah.
Because here's the deal: they make the rules, they then enforce the rules and investigate what they perceive to be wrongdoing. So they abuse that power, and then they adjudicate that. That's what James Madison said is the quintessential definition of tyranny.
Sure.
As all those powers combined in one place. We've done that over and over again for 100 years now.
Right.
The second thing is, and I actually heard a congressman say this once, that the purpose that they do this vague language and delegate authority is so members of Congress are not held accountable.
Oh, I agree with that.
So they can stand up and say, well, you know, that's the EPA's doing.
Exactly.
It's not me. I'll work on, see what we can do to fix. That is bogus.
Agreed. 100%.
And the third thing is, we have we have basically allowed them to run away with no oversight. We don't defund. I ran a bill 4 years ago to get rid of an agency that everyone agreed was duplicative. You know what they? I lost 4 Republican votes in the committee, and I couldn't even get out of the committee when it was a Republican majority.
You know, and that's it's so troubling when that happens. Remember the trouble that Ronald Reagan had to shut down the Interstate Commerce Commission, which I believe is the only agency, right? Because the other agencies have morphed into other things. You know, we have Homeland Security, for instance. It was an amalgam of
17 now.
Yeah. But you know, I can't think of a single agency that has ever been zeroed out in my lifetime, except for the Interstate Commerce Commission. And we saw the rigmarole that the president went through for that. I mean, this is. And you're right. There is, at least during the beginning part of the Trump administration, there were those executive orders on regulatory transparency and accountability, and the idea that these agencies had to open themselves up. Any hope of seeing in a Republican Congress with a Republican president down the road some way of codifying that kind of language?
Well, I would hope so.
Yeah.
I know that many of my colleagues agree with that 100%. In fact, I would say most Republicans, if not all, agree with that in Congress. But you got to have the courage.
That's exactly it.
And the political will. And then the other problem is we're a bicameral body, and it'll take 60 votes in the Senate, but there are ways to get around that.
Sure.
And the senators have to say that that's a priority. And if we're going to save the country, I believe you got to devolve power away from the center and back to the states. And one of the ways you do that is you start dismantling the federal bureaucratic state.
You have to.
And if you do that, then the states, I mean, like Arizona, when I was there, we had to fight OSHA on a particular standard that our state standard produced better results than the federal standard.
It's amazing how that.
Yeah, the data was clear, and we'd say, well, but here we are, and they would say, we want you to do this.
Yeah.
We had to fight them on dust and air pollution.
Oh yeah.
And they'd say, well, you got too much, pollutants in the air, and it's dust is your number one particulate. Okay, well, how would you have us solve dust in a desert?
Yeah.
Water, they would say.
Sure.
And so he said, well, you want us to do water, and then the other half of the EPA would say, you guys are wasting water.
It's funny because it gets down to one of my other favorite examples I talk about, which is that EPA wanted to abate dust, right? So they forced a bunch of folks to pave over their parking lots. Businesses, they pave over their parking lots, and then what happens? They come back and they say, well, no, now under the Safe Drinking Water Act, you now have created all of this impervious surface. Right. You have the runoff, so we're now going to tax you for that. And so you're damned if you're doing, you're damned if you don't.
Yeah.
In the end.
Yeah, and that's why you have to start taking this apart. And members in Congress, and quite frankly, a lot of them live in a bubble. They don't appreciate it. I mean, they'll go back and say hi, and they'll do a chamber event and eat breakfast with them. The reality is, you have to take a hard look
100%.
at what we're doing here and how it impacts locals.
Let's talk about the 5th Congressional District. Actually, before we talk about the 5th Congressional, let me ask you this. So you were in the State Senate for 14 years?
Senate for 6, House for 8.
Okay, got it. But so how different is the federal Congress from your experience in the state legislature? I may be the only person who's ever asked you that question.
No, you're not. You're not. In fact, I was on the floor sitting with a colleague of mine who served in the state legislature with me, and we were lamenting that in the state legislature, first of all, even when you had disagreements with the governor, you worked with the governor.
Sure, of course.
Even if you had disagreements, you could move stuff through much more quickly.
Interesting.
And much more substantive, and would have immediate impact, and you would see that stuff. In Congress, like with this administration, I've never seen Joe Biden.
Sure.
I mean, for sure. And then the Democrats have changed the rules.
Yeah.
The first rule they changed is they said you can't remove Nancy Pelosi as Speaker if you got the votes.
Yeah.
So they do all that stuff, and they slow it down on one hand, and then when they want to do something, they'll speed it up, jam it through without debate. I mean, in a state legislature, you have regular debates where everybody gets together and have the debate.
I have a colleague who is very big on the concept of returning to regular order as a way of solving problems.
Yes.
We certainly need that. So, okay, let me put a hypothetical out there. I am coming out to Arizona. I got some days to spend for whatever reason. I'm coming out there for business, but I come out there a little early. I make my way east of Phoenix to the 5th Congressional District. Yeah. What should I see in the 5th?
First of all, great restaurants in the 5th, whether it's Gilbert, Chandler, Mesa, the QC, AJ. Then you need to get out toward the Superstition Mountains. And get out there in Lost Dutchman State Park. You got to go in and hike in the trails that are all around my district, and just great stuff. And then you can never go wrong. We've got perhaps the world's largest state athletic park. There's always games going on out there. So. And then let's face it, a lot of people come to Arizona to golf.
Sure.
So you're going to want to golf. You're going to enjoy the weather. The bottom line is you're going to want to get out of your house, get out of your car, and move around. We got the Riparian Preserve 5 minutes from my house. Bird watchers from all over the world come in.
That's great.
And what's crazy is we have some flood irrigation, and when that happens, exotic birds from the Riparian Preserve come from that place and they land in my yard.
That's amazing.
So it's a great place.
Well, listen, you just got to be careful with that because
Can't touch them.
You can't touch them. And remember, there were justices who were thinking you can't even look at them in your backyard. You're going to shut them down. So let me ask you before I let you go. So I contemplated this whole other podcast called Outside Interest, where we talk to folks in politics and policy about stuff having nothing to do with politics and policy. I know you're a member of Congress, so you don't have a whole ton of free time. But what are some of your outside interests? What have been your outside interests?
So I read a lot of books. I write a lot, and but I also do music. And so last night in D.C., my band played, and we did a short set.
I had no idea. What do you play?
Last night I played keyboards.
Okay.
Yeah, but I do some guitar work as well. I used to play the bass a lot in different bands, and.
What kind of music are you playing? Listen. I know you've got to go, but now you've sort of tapped into something here.
Yeah. So I like all kinds of music, but that band that we have now is a cover band. So we play rock and rolls from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to 2000s.
Are you a vinyl guy? Were you a vinyl guy?
I was a vinyl guy.
Okay.
But right now I don't care. I just listen to any format. And I listen to what I like. There's only two kinds of music: music I like and music I don't like.
So what's a go-to? See, this is exactly what I want to do in this other podcast, which is this idea of, because I don't know if you know Jim Neal over on the Senate side. He works with Leader McConnell. Jim's a big music guy. There's an activist, policy guy in town named Bill Pasco, who's huge into music.
Yeah.
I love. So what's sort of your go-to favorite band, favorite concert you might have seen?
So.
I know it's tough.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, but so I like right now, if you finger picking guitar, do some finger picking. Tommy Manuel's good. There's a couple other guys like that, but Steve Vai was a great concert. So who else recently? I'm going to go to a group called Leonidas and Friends coming to Higley.
Okay.
I don't know if you've heard of Leonidas. These are Ukrainian Russians
Fascinating.
who are touring America. It's always interesting. They've been a band since well before the conflict over there. They do covers. They do covers,
astounding.
And they're incredible. They'll play Earth, Wind, and Fire in Chicago, and just beautiful renditions. So, I'll do classical. I'll do jazz.
Amazing.
I'll even do some country if I like it. I know people can't believe this, but there's some Post Malone stuff I like.
Sure.
I mean, so it's just if I like it, I like it. If I don't, I don't.
No, I get that. I actually sent a friend of mine my playlist, and it was 60s rock and 70s stuff, funk and disco and world music.
So coming out, Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto I like Van Cliburn's the best. I know there's some other great ones that play that, but I mean that's where I go.
Well, Congressman, listen, you and I clearly could spend a lot of time talking about that, but I know your time is precious. Thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it.
You've been watching and/or listening to the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. Enjoy the rest of your lunch. See you next week.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.